Werewolf romance story, written by Judith. Prologue. The coronation hall is vast, smoke-filled, and oppressive. Snow falls, mingling with ash. The pack is gathered, anticipation in the air. The throne room is dimly lit by torches casting long shadows over the stone floors.
Crown requires a pillar of stone, Willis, not a heartbeat of glass. I sever the cord. I renounce the bond.
You can't take that from me, Silas. You can't erase what we were.
I will. You are nothing to me now, Willa. Just a ghost.
Then let me fade, Silas. Let me disappear into the Shatter Peaks. You'll never hear my voice again.
I'm not weak, Silas. I will prove that to you. To everyone.
You are already gone, Willa. Your choice is made.
It was never your choice to make. I may be gone, but the pack will remember me.
Before we continue, thank you for giving this story your time. If you're feeling it, drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what made you click on Judy's romance library today. Your engagement is the only reason we can keep bringing you these stories. Don't just lurk, make yourself known. Chapter 1. The Ashfall Rejection, the throne room of the Iron Citadel, had never held so many wolves. Willa pressed herself against the cold stone of the western archway, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she watched the coronation unfold below. Hundreds of torches burned from blackened sconces, casting writhing shadows across the faces of territorial lords, military commanders, and common pack members who had journeyed from every frozen corner of the realm to witness this moment. The claiming. She should not have come. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to return to the small quarters in the scout barracks where she had spent the last 7 days sick with hope, waiting for Silas to send for her. But he had sent nothing. No summons, no reassurance, only the deafening silence of a man preparing to make a choice. And so she had come to see it with her own eyes. The Alpha King stood on the obsidian dais at the hall's center, his shoulders locked beneath the weight of ceremonial armor, black steel etched with silver wolf script that proclaimed him ruler of the Northern Territories. Even from this distance, Willa could see the hard line of his jaw, the dark hair cropped close to his skull, the predator's stillness that made lesser wolves avert their gaze in instinctive deference. For 8 months, she had known a different version of him. The man who had found her bleeding in the snow after a border skirmish and carried her 3 miles to safety. The man whose hands shook when he traced the constellation of scars across her shoulders. The man who had bitten the tender flesh of her inner wrist in the darkness of the northern watchtower. The secret claiming mark he gave her the night he swore she was his fated mate. When I secure the fractured territories, he had promised, his forehead pressed to hers, his voice raw with something that sounded like desperation. When the lords stop circling like vultures and the throne is no longer contested, I will announce you to the kingdom. You will stand beside me, Willa. Nothing will change that. She had believed him. Her hand moved instinctively to her wrist, where the crescent-shaped scar had faded to silver, a mark only she could see. A promise only she had kept. The candidates will now approach. The High Elder's voice cut through the hall like a blade through ice, ancient and absolute. Willa's nails bit into her palms as 3 women in frost-white gowns ascended the dais steps, daughters of the most powerful bloodlines in the north, each one beautiful in the way weapons are beautiful, sharp, polished, deadly, each one trained from birth for this exact possibility. And at their center, with hair like a raven's wing and eyes the color of winter steel, walked Vada of House Thornwick. The crowd murmured with approval. The Thornwicks controlled the western reach, commanded a private army of 1,500 swords, and had been positioning their daughter for this moment since Silas's father fell in battle 3 years prior. Willa searched Silas's face for any trace of the man she knew, any flicker of warmth, of recognition, of the bond that hummed between them like a living wire. His expression was carved from granite. Alpha King Silas, the High Elder intoned, the kingdom awaits your choice. Will you claim your fated mate, or will you forge an alliance through strategic union? The hall fell silent. Not the comfortable silence of anticipation, but the suffocating quiet of a held breath, of wolves sensing violence on the wind. Silas's gaze swept across the crowd. For one suspended heartbeat, his eyes found hers across the sea of faces. She saw the recognition. She saw the war behind his eyes. Then she saw him choose. "I choose the kingdom," he said, and his voice carried the finality of a gravestone settling into frozen earth. "I choose survival over superstition." He turned to face Vada, and when he spoke again, every word was a nail driven into Willa's chest. "A crown requires a pillar of stone, not a heartbeat of glass." The silver thread between them, the bond she had felt since the moment their eyes first met on that blood-soaked battlefield, began to smoke. Not metaphorically, she could see it, shimmering in the air between them like heat rising from summer stone, turning from quicksilver to ash. "I, Alpha King Silas of the Iron Citadel, sever the cord." The thread blackened. "I renounce the bond." It shattered. The pain was not romantic. It was not the sweet ache of a broken heart in a tragic ballad. It was biological terrorism. Her nervous system rejecting itself, her wolf howling in a frequency only she could hear, her place in the pack mind ripping away like skin torn from muscle. She did not cry out. She had been a scout for 6 years. She had survived ambushes, starvation, and the kind of cold that turned breath to ice in your lungs. She knew how to endure, but she could not stay. Around her, pack members began to shift uncomfortably, their gazes sliding past her as though she had become translucent. The severed bond was already rewriting their reality. She was no longer pack, no longer visible to the collective consciousness that bound them. She was a ghost. Willa gathered her worn leather coat from where it had fallen, pulled it tight against the sudden cold that had nothing to do with temperature, and turned toward the eastern exit. No one stopped her. No one even looked. She walked through the halls she had once guarded, past the kitchens where she had stolen bread and laughter with the other scouts, past the war room where she had stood at Silas's side and marked enemy positions on frost-covered maps. She walked until she reached the outer gates, where snow was beginning to fall. Real snow now, not the ash from the coronation fires. The guard on duty glanced at her, his eyes clouding with confusion as his mind struggled to reconcile her physical presence with her newly invisible status. "Shouldn't be out in this," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Blizzard's coming." "I know," Willa said quietly. She stepped past him, out of the torchlight, out of the kingdom, out of the life she had foolishly believed could be hers. Behind her, through the stone walls, she heard the roar of celebration as Silas claimed Veda's hand. Ahead of her, the shatter peaks waited, jagged mountains wreathed in permanent winter, where the wind screamed like a living thing and nothing survived for long. Willa pulled her hood up against the snow and walked toward them. She did not look back. She chose the mercy of the cold over the cruelty of his crown. Chapter 2. The White Silence. The blizzard found her before dawn. Willa had made it 6 miles into the shatter peaks when the wind began to scream. Not the plaintive howl of a winter storm, but something ancient and deliberate, as though the mountain itself was trying to warn her away. Snow came sideways, each flake sharp as broken glass, against her exposed skin. She wrapped her coat tighter and kept walking, her boots sinking deeper with each step into drifts that seemed to have no bottom. She had no destination, no plan beyond the next step, and the step after that. The severed bond had left a void in her chest that made breathing feel like swallowing stones. Every time she tried to reach for the pack mind, that constant hum of belonging that had surrounded her since childhood, she found only static and absence. It was like losing a sense she'd never known she relied on. She was deaf and blind in ways that had nothing to do with her ears or eyes. The physical pain was almost a relief. At least cold was honest. At least the mountain didn't pretend to love her while calculating how much she was worth in territorial alliances. Better the cold, better the honest cruelty of nature than the calculated brutality of a man who had looked her in the eyes and chosen power over her. By the 3rd hour, she could no longer feel her feet. The leather of her boots had frozen solid, and each step sent cracks of ice up her shins. By the 5th hour, she had stopped shivering, which she knew from survival training meant her body was surrendering to the freeze. Her core temperature was dropping, her organs beginning to shut down in the methodical way of all living things that had reached their limit. She stumbled into a ravine. Didn't see it coming, just suddenly the ground wasn't there, and she was falling, tumbling through snow and air until she landed in a drift that came up to her waist. She tried to stand and couldn't. Her legs had stopped taking orders from her brain. This was acceptable. This was a clean death. The mountain would take her, and in a few months the snow would melt and carry her bones down to the valley, and no one would know she had ever climbed this high. No one would carve her name into the memorial stones. No one would howl her passage to the next world. She would simply cease to exist, the way she had ceased to exist in the pack mine the moment Silas spoke those words. She closed her eyes and waited for the darkness. The wind stopped. Not gradually. It ceased as though someone had shut a door. The silence was so complete it hurt. Willa's eyes snapped open, and the world had changed. The ravine had transformed into something that didn't belong in the natural world. The walls of ice now glowed with a faint blue luminescence that pulsed like a heartbeat, and the snow beneath her had gone still as glass. Standing before her was a figure that made her wolf, already broken and howling in the empty space where the pack mine should be, go completely silent. The mountain spirit wore the shape of a woman carved from living snow, her form shifting and reforming with each breath Willa took. She was beautiful in the way avalanches are beautiful, in the way death is beautiful when you stop fighting it. Her eyes were twin points of frozen starlight, older than memory, colder than the space between worlds. When she spoke, her voice was the groan of glaciers shifting in the deep places of the earth, the crack of ice breaking in the spring thaw, the whisper of snow falling on snow for 10,000 years. You carry two hearts now, Walker. One beats for you, one beats for what comes after. Willa's hand moved to her stomach before her mind could catch up. The gesture was instinctive, protective, impossible. She had been careful. She had counted the days, tracked her cycles with the precision of a scout marking enemy movements on winter maps. She couldn't be pregnant. She couldn't be carrying the child of a man who had just rejected her in front of his entire kingdom. But the bond had masked everything. The bond had rewritten her biology in ways she hadn't understood, accelerating processes, hiding symptoms, making her body believe that the claiming was complete and sacred when it had only ever been secret and doomed. 8 months. The secret claiming. The night in the northern watchtower when Silas had pressed his teeth to her wrist and sworn she was his fated mate, that nothing in this world or the next could tear them apart. He had lied. Or maybe he had believed it at the time, and then found something he wanted more. I can't, Willa whispered. I can't bring a child into this. I can't. The child is already here, the spirit said, and her voice carried no judgment, no sympathy, just the implacable truth of mountains that had watched wolves rise and fall and rise again. The question is not whether you survive, Walker. The question is whether you remember. Remember what? Willa's voice came out broken, barely a whisper against the supernatural silence of the ravine. That you were never glass, you were always stone. They simply refused to see it. The spirit tilted her head, studying Willa with the detached curiosity of something that had watched civilizations rise and crumble into the permafrost. He called you fragile because your strength frightened him. He called you soft because your resilience made his own weakness unbearable. But you walked 6 miles into my domain in a blizzard that would kill a grown male wolf in an hour. You are still breathing when you should be frozen. You are still fighting when you should have surrendered. I'm not fighting, Willa said. I'm dying. No. The spirit's smile was terrible and kind. You are transforming. She reached out, and her touch was winter-given form. Where her fingers brushed Willa's forehead, frost bloomed across her skin in intricate patterns, fractals that told the story of every woman who had ever walked away from a man who couldn't see her worth, every wolf who had ever chosen the mercy of the mountain over the cruelty of the pack. The pain of the severed bond didn't disappear. It transformed. It became something she could carry, something she could shape into armor, something that made her stronger instead of breaking her apart. The void in her chest filled with ice that burned colder than fire, a new kind of power that had nothing to do with pack hierarchy or mate bonds, or the approval of men who mistook control for strength. When Willa opened her eyes again, the spirit was gone. The ravine was just a ravine, but she was no longer dying. Her body thrummed with a strange cold vitality that had nothing to do with her wolf and everything to do with the mountain's claim on her. She could feel the child now, a presence curled tight beneath her heart, stubborn and fierce and determined to survive. She pulled herself to her feet. Her legs worked. The cold no longer bit. She looked back toward the distant lights of the Iron Citadel, barely visible through the falling snow, and felt nothing but the clean clarity of a door closing on a life that had never truly been hers. Willa of the Northern Pack was dead. She had walked into the blizzard, and the blizzard had consumed her, stripped her down to bone and marrow, and rebuilt her into something that could survive where soft things perished. What climbed out of that ravine was something new, something the old legends had warned about but never truly believed could exist. The ghost of the peaks. And she was done running. Chapter 3. The Cinder King. 5 years had turned Silas into something the old legends warned about. He stood in the ruins of Ashwood Village, watching the last house collapse into embers, and felt nothing. The black veins had spread from his chest to his throat now. Visible even in the firelight, dark rivers of corruption that marked him as a man rotting from the inside out. The mate rot. The price of severing a fated bond and expecting to walk away unscathed. His generals kept their distance, their faces carefully neutral. They had learned not to question him after he'd executed the first 3 who dared suggest mercy. Veda stood at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her expression one of manufactured concern. "My king," she murmured, her voice honey over steel. "Perhaps we should return to the citadel. The scouts reported nothing here." Silas shook her off. He had smelled it. Just for a moment, beneath the scent of burning timber and melted snow, wildflowers and pine smoke, the smell of a woman who had walked away from him 5 years ago and taken his sanity with her. It had been a child. A girl of maybe 7 who sold herbs in the market. She had been wearing a dried flower crown, and when the wind shifted, Silas had caught the scent, and something in his fractured mind had snapped. He'd given the order to burn the village before he'd even registered what he was doing. Now there were 63 new ghosts added to the collection that followed him through his dreams. 63 lives traded for the ghost of a memory that wasn't even real. "Your Majesty," one of his captains approached carefully, the way one might approach a wounded bear. "The survivors are asking for clemency. They swear they've seen no one matching the description." Silas turned to look at the man, and watched him flinch at whatever he saw in his king's eyes. "Then they're lying. Burn what's left. Salt the fields. I want nothing standing." The captain bowed and retreated. Orders were orders, even when they came from a madman. Veda's fingers found his arm again, and this time her grip was firmer. "Silas, you're exhausted. The rot is spreading. We need to get you back to the court physicians." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The physicians can't cure what's killing me, Vada. You know that. The only cure is finding her." "She's dead." Veda's voice was patient, practiced. She had said these words 1,000 times over the past 5 years, each iteration smoothing the edges of his hope a little more. "She walked into the Shatter Peaks in a blizzard. No one survives that." Silas looked down at his hands. The veins had reached his fingertips now, black tributaries spreading like cracks in ice. He had maybe a year left, maybe less. The rot would consume him the way it consumed all alphas who rejected their fated mates, eating away at his mind until there was nothing left but rage and ash. Some distant, dying part of him recognized that Vada's influence had grown too strong, that her whispers in the dark had shaped his descent, that the woman he'd married to secure the Western Reach had been feeding him carefully crafted lies, turning his search for Willa into an obsession, his obsession into madness. But he was too far gone to care. He had burned 17 villages, executed 42 people on suspicion of harboring her, turned the Northern Territories into a kingdom of fear and cinders. And still, she eluded him. The ghost of the peaks, they called her now. The woman who had survived the unsurvivable. The myth that walked through his nightmares with frost in her hair and judgment in her eyes. Silas turned away from the burning village and climbed back onto his horse. His void armor, black steel spiked and heavy, creaked with the movement. "Where to next, my king?" Vada asked. He stared north, toward the mountains that had swallowed the only thing he'd ever truly wanted. "Everywhere. We search everywhere." Behind him, Ashwood Village burned down to nothing, and the wind carried the screams to the uncaring sky. Chapter 4. The Boy Who Breathes Frost. Coda was building a fortress out of ice when Willa found him, and watching her son work never stopped stealing her breath. He crouched in the clearing behind the supply hut, his small hands pressed against the snow, frost spreading from his fingertips in crystalline patterns that defied natural formation. The ice grew upward in spiraling towers, formed battlements that would make military architects weep with envy, created archways that caught the weak afternoon light and fractured it into rainbows. He was 5 years old and already commanded winter with the casual certainty that other children used to stack blocks or draw pictures in dirt. He was the heart of their hidden sanctuary, a community of 73 outcasts who had found refuge in the frozen wasteland where no sane wolf would search. Refugees from Silas's purges, survivors of burned villages, wolves who had been cast out for questioning the Cinder King's madness, children who had watched their parents executed and had nowhere else to go. They had followed the rumors of the ghost of the peaks and found not a myth, but a woman who had built something impossible in the place where she should have died. "It needs to be stronger, Mama," Coda said without looking up, his voice carrying that peculiar certainty that only children possess. His breath came out in visible puffs that turned to frost in the air, another sign of the power that ran through him like a second bloodline. "The Bad King is coming." Willa's chest tightened. She had tried to protect him from the truth, had told him stories that painted his father as a distant figure who didn't know he existed, rather than a monster who had rejected everything they could have been. But Coda had his father's eyes, storm gray and unnervingly perceptive, and he had inherited her ability to read the mountain's moods like other children read picture books. The winter heart magic that had saved her life in the blizzard had passed to him in the womb, transformed into something purer, something that belonged entirely to the child and not to the trauma that created it. Where her power was sharp and defensive, built from survival and spite, his was gentle and creative, shaped by innocence and the belief that ice could be beautiful instead of deadly. "How do you know?" She knelt beside him in the snow, ignoring the cold that would have sent other wolves scrambling for shelter. Her tolerance for winter had become absolute after 5 years of living at the edge of the world. She watched the ice fortress grow taller under his touch, admiring the architecture of it, the way each tower was slightly different but perfectly balanced. "The ravens are flying wrong," Coda said, pointing to the sky where black shapes wheeled in agitated patterns, their calls sharp and warning. "And the wind smells like burning, and—" He paused, his small face scrunching in concentration. "And the mountain is scared." That last part sent ice down her spine that had nothing to do with temperature. Coda's connection to the peaks ran deeper than hers, a bond that had been forged before he drew his first breath. If the mountain was scared, if the ancient presence that had saved her 5 years ago was unsettled, then the danger was real. Willa lifted her gaze to the southern ridge and saw what she had been dreading for 5 years but had always known would come. Banners, black and silver, catching the weak afternoon light like wounds in the white landscape. At least 300 soldiers, maybe more, moving through the mountain pass with the methodical precision of men who had done this 100 times before, who had learned exactly how to sweep through territory and leave nothing but questions and corpses in their wake. The scorched search had finally reached them. She had always known this day would come. Silas's madness had consumed village after village, creeping northward like a plague carried on wind and rumor. She had watched from the peaks as distant settlements burned, seen the smoke signals that meant another community had refused to surrender information they didn't have, heard the stories from refugees who made it to her sanctuary with frostbite and trauma, and tales of the Cinder King's descent into something that barely qualified as human anymore. Each burning had brought him closer. Each execution had narrowed the map. Each destroyed village had eliminated another place she could be hiding. And now, after 5 years of systematic annihilation, he had finally reached the edge of the world where she had built her impossible home. "Gather the others," Willa said quietly, her hand finding Coda's shoulder. His small body was warm beneath her palm, radiating the heat that all children carried regardless of the winter heart magic that let him sculpt ice like clay. "Tell them to pack only what they can carry on their backs. Food, medicine, weapons, warm clothes, nothing else. We moved to the deep caves before nightfall." But the fortress? Coda's protest was automatic, the grief of a child being asked to abandon something he'd spent hours creating. "We'll still be here when we return." If we return, she didn't say. If there's anything left to return to. If your father doesn't burn every standing structure in a 10-mile radius the way he's burned everything else. Coda was 5. He didn't need to carry the weight of her fear or her fury or the complicated knot of emotions that came with knowing the man hunting her was the same man who had given her this perfect, impossible child. The boy looked up at her with those impossible gray eyes, and for a moment she saw the man who had given them to him. The man before the crown, before the choice, before everything turned to ash and regret. There was something of Silas in the shape of his face, in the stubborn set of his jaw, in the way he processed problems with careful thought before speaking, but there was more of her in his stillness, his resilience, his ability to find beauty in harsh places. "Mama, why doesn't he stop looking?" The question was asked with the blunt curiosity of childhood, free of judgment but full of genuine confusion. Because I was the only real thing he ever had, Willa thought. Because some men would rather burn the world than admit they were wrong. Because he built his entire identity on control. And I had the audacity to survive without his permission, to become something more than what he tried to reduce me to. And that makes me dangerous in ways that armies and alliances could never be. Because some people don't know when to let go, she said instead, brushing snow from his dark hair. Because they mistake obsession for love, and they can't tell the difference between fixing a mistake and refusing to accept consequences. Coda nodded as though this made perfect sense, processing the information with the same serious consideration he gave to everything. Then he pressed his palm to the ice fortress one last time, and Willa watched as the structure solidified, reinforced by his touch. The towers became unbreakable, the walls thick enough to withstand any siege, a small monument to childish hope in a world that had forgotten what hope looked like. "Will you fight him?" Coda asked, standing and brushing snow from his knees. Willa looked at her son, this miracle born from rejection and transformation, this child who had never known his father's warmth but had never lacked for love, and felt something shift in her chest. For 5 years she had been running, building, hiding, protecting her people by staying invisible, by becoming a ghost story that kept them safe through fear and mystery. But the time for hiding was over. The Cinder King had come to her doorstep, and she could either retreat deeper into the mountains, pushing her people further into the inhospitable waste, or she could stand and show him exactly what he had thrown away. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'll fight him, but not the way he expects." Below them, Iron Watch Outpost rose from the snow, their southernmost defensive position, a 3-story watchtower that housed their scouts and supply stores. By midnight, the first torch would be lit. By dawn, it would be ashes. But Willa wasn't planning to defend Iron Watch. She was planning to use it as the stage for a reckoning 5 years in the making. She pulled Coda close, feeling his small arms wrap around her waist, and watched the banners advance. The wind gathered around her like an old friend preparing for war, and somewhere deep in the mountain she felt the ancient presence that had saved her stir with approval. The ghost of the peaks was done running. The Cinder King wanted to find her. Fine, she would let him. And when he finally saw what she had become, when he understood the magnitude of what he had discarded, it would break him in ways that no battle ever could. Chapter 5. The Reckoning at Iron Watch. The outpost burned exactly as Silas had planned. His soldiers had surrounded the structure at dusk, cutting off every escape route before setting the fires. The building was ancient stone and timber, 3 stories of watchtower that had stood for 200 years, and it went up like kindling soaked in oil. Flames climbed the walls, casting writhing shadows across the snow, turning night into a hellscape of orange and black. Silas sat on his horse at the perimeter, the heat washing over his void armor in waves that made the metal creak. The black veins had reached his jaw now, creeping up his face like roots of some poisonous tree. He had maybe 6 months left, maybe less. Every day the rot took more of him, eating away at the man he'd been until only the monster remained. But he could feel her. For the first time in 5 years, the phantom pull of the severed bond was screaming that she was close. "Your Majesty!" His captain approached on foot, his face smudged with soot. "The building is clear, no one inside, but there are tracks leading north, recent." Of course there were. The ghost knew how to run. She'd been running for 5 years, always one step ahead, always just beyond his reach, but tonight was different. Tonight he had burned her sanctuary, cut off her supply lines, destroyed the one place she might have called home. Tonight she would have to face him. Movement caught his eye, a figure emerging from the smoke and snow on the northern ridge. Small at first, just a silhouette against the white, but growing clearer with each step. Dark coat, long hair whipping in the wind, walking away from the burning outpost with the unhurried gait of someone who had nothing left to fear. Silas's heart, what remained of it, stopped. Willa! His voice cracked on her name, 5 years of searching and madness compressed into 2 syllables. He dismounted without thinking, his boots hitting the frozen ground hard enough to send shocks up his corrupted legs. She didn't run, didn't stumble, didn't look back. She just kept walking, her figure framed by fire and falling snow, exactly like the fever dreams that had haunted him since the night he'd made his choice. Willa! He started forward, pushing past his soldiers, his breathing ragged. Stop, I order you to. She stopped. Not because he'd commanded it, but because she chose to. She turned slowly, deliberately, and even from 30 yards away he could see that she was not the woman he remembered. This was not the soft-eyed scout who had traced his scars with trembling fingers. This was something forged in ice and abandonment, something that had survived what should have killed her and come back harder for it. The ground beneath Silas's feet trembled. Frost spread from where Willa stood, racing across the snow in fractal patterns, climbing the burning timbers of Iron Watch and extinguishing flames with the hiss of steam and death. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. The air itself seemed to crystallize. His soldiers backed away, hands on weapons they didn't know how to use against this. Willa raised her hand and the wind answered. Not the natural wind of the mountains, but something older, something that had been waiting in the bones of the world for someone worthy enough to command it. You burned my home, she said, and her voice carried across the distance like judgment itself. You hunted my people. You turned yourself into exactly the monster I refused to stand beside. Silas took another step forward, his hand outstretched. I came to bring you back, to fix what There is nothing to fix. Ice crept up her arms in elegant spirals, armor and decoration both. You made your choice 5 years ago. I made mine the moment I walked away. Our bond is dead. The words hit him like physical blows. You killed it the night you chose stone over glass, remember? I'm not here to save you, Silas. I'm here to make sure you understand that while you were ripping your kingdom apart searching for me, you were the only one still trapped in the past. The ground trembled again, harder this time, and Silas realized with dawning horror that she wasn't just threatening him. She was showing him what he'd lost. Power, true power, not the kind built on armies and alliances, but the kind earned through survival, through transformation, through becoming something more than what the world said you were allowed to be. The ghost of the peak smiled, and it was not kind. Go home, Cinder King. There's nothing for you here but ash. Chapter 6. The Throne of Self. Silas's guards moved before he could stop them. 12 soldiers rushing forward with weapons drawn, their training overriding their fear. They made it 7 steps before Willa raised both hands, and the mountain answered her call. Ice erupted from the ground in jagged spears, creating a wall between her and the advancing men. Not to kill, she could have killed them all without breaking a sweat, but to stop. To show restraint that Silas himself had abandoned years ago. The soldiers stumbled backward, their breath coming in panicked clouds, staring at a woman who commanded winter itself. Stand down, Silas ordered, his voice hoarse. His guards obeyed immediately, grateful for the excuse to retreat. The silence that followed was broken by a small voice from behind Willa. Mama? Silas's world tilted sideways. A child emerged from the tree line, no more than 5 years old, with dark hair and a face still round with youth. But it was the eyes that destroyed him, storm gray, his eyes. The eyes he saw every morning in the mirror before the mate rot had turned him into something unrecognizable. Koda Tswo, I told you to stay with the others, Willa said, but her voice had lost its edge. She reached back, and the boy took her hand, studying Silas with the solemn curiosity of a child who had been told stories about monsters and was now seeing one in person. Is that him? Koda asked. The bad king? Silas fell to his knees, not in supplication, but because his legs simply stopped working. 5 years. 5 years she had been raising his son in the frozen wasteland while he burned villages and executed innocents searching for her. 5 years he had been a father and never knew it, because he had chosen a crown over the only thing that mattered. How old? He whispered. 5. Willa's voice was flat, factual. He was born in the deep winter. He has never known warmth. He has never known safety because his father turned the world into a hunting ground. I didn't know. You didn't ask. She moved in front of Coda, a wall of flesh and ice between her child and the man who had thrown them both away. You made a choice that night, Silas. You chose power over partnership, control over connection, and when I survived what should have killed me, instead of accepting that I had moved on, you turned your grief into violence and made an entire kingdom bleed for your regret. Silas looked down at his hands, black veins, trembling fingers, the physical manifestation of a man rotting from his mistakes. I can fix this. Let me fix this. Come back, both of you. I'll abdicate. No. The word was final as a grave closing. You don't get to swoop in and play savior now. You don't get redemption through grand gestures. You threw away glass because you wanted stone, remember? Well, I became stone. I became the mountain itself. And I built something here. A community of people you would have discarded, children who needed safety you couldn't provide, a life that has nothing to do with you. Then what? Silas's voice broke. I just go, pretend I never saw him, pretend you don't exist? Willa was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of mercy he didn't deserve. You guard our borders. You take what's left of your life, and you spend it protecting the people you failed, instead of hunting the woman who survived you. You become the shield instead of the sword. And maybe, in whatever time you have left, you learn that your value was never in your crown. It was in your capacity to change. She turned away, taking Coda's hand. The boy looked back once, studying his father with those impossible gray eyes, then disappeared into the snow with his mother. Silas remained on his knees in the ashen ice, watching them vanish. Behind him, Iron Watch smoldered. His soldiers waited for orders. The mate rot ate another piece of his heart. But for the first time in 5 years, he understood. Willa hadn't needed him to save her. She had needed him to see her. And he had been too busy building empires to notice he was standing on glass. The ghost of the peaks was gone. The Cinder King remained. And in the space between them, a lesson written in frost. Your worth is not determined by those who cannot recognize it. It simply is. If this story reminded you of your own strength, or if you've ever walked away from someone who couldn't see your value, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video. Tag someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment with the moment that hit you hardest. And if you're not already subscribed to Judy's Romance Library, what are you waiting for? We're building a community of people who refuse to settle, who know their worth, and who understand that sometimes the best revenge is becoming someone they can never reach again. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's keep telling stories about people who chose themselves, because that's the real power move.